Good morning. I love the song He Lives. I love it so very much. It's such a beautiful song. My only complaint about it is when I speak, I do this thing where when I'm getting ready to go up, I feel like there's energy building up inside. I feel like I'm ready to go. And so what happens is, traditionally at the end of the song, when Tom makes his announcement that I'm speaking, my mode is like, all right, let's do this. And that song is great, except at the end of every verse, it sounds like the song is ending. Because there's that strong finish at the end, and it's always the same throughout all four verses, that He lives within my heart, and it's like the strong stop, and then the next verse. So for the last three verses, I stand up there going, okay, which verse are we on? I'm ready to go. No, one more verse. Wait, one more. I was asked by a friend at dinner last week why I got into ministry. It's something we haven't talked about. And the knee-jerk response I always have is, well, I want to help people, but I'm too claustrophobic to be a fireman. Like, the whole mask concept freaks me out. And I don't have enough insight into the human condition to be a psychologist, so I figured ministry was a good way to go. And it's kind of a snarky response to a legitimate question. And so it kind of got me on the train of thought of why I did get into ministry, and I thought that would be an interesting topic for today. To talk about the idea of not just my career in the field of ministry, but the idea of Christianity in general, and the idea of why are we Christians? Why do we have the faith that we do? Why do we choose to not sleep in on Sunday mornings? Why do we choose to gather together and worship? That sleeping in comment got a few eyebrows raised. Like, wait a second, why don't we sleep in on Sunday mornings? Well, I'm here to answer that question, my good people. We're going to be looking at Philippians chapter 4 today. And before I get into that, I want to talk about this movie that I saw last week. I saw this really great independent film by one of my all-time favorite comedians. The movie's called Sleepwalk With Me, and it's about the life of an early comedian. And the reason it's called that is because the comedian in question suffers from this sleep disorder. I think it's called REM behavior disorder, and it causes his body to not be paralyzed when he is sleeping. And so when you have those terrifying dreams that we often have as people, where we're running for something or we're late for something, there's something in his brain that does not trigger the necessary chemical to paralyze him. And the end result is he acts out his dreams. He actually physically gets up and he goes out, and if he's being chased, he actually runs. And until he's woken up from this state, he actually actively continues to move and act out these horrific images in his head while he's having nightmares. And the movie is interesting unto itself because it's not just about that. It's also about his relationship with his girlfriend and how they've been together for 8 years, but he doesn't know if he wants to be with them or if he wants to be with her. And in addition to that, it's also about his early life in the career of stand-up comedy. And stand-up comedy, I know a lot of people don't have insight into that, but I actually know a lot of stand-up comics. And comedy is one of the hardest industries to get into because it requires you to be your own person. You can have an agent, you can have somebody try and look for jobs for you, but what it boils down to is you have to be a self-motivated person in order to do this. And a lot of the times you fail early on. And the reason I bring this up in particular is because there's this line that the comedian learned throughout the course of this movie. The movie is based on a one-man show, which is based on real events in his life. And he said that one of the first things he learned about comedy was you have to tell yourself it's going great all the time. Because if you stop and you acknowledge the reality that you're just tanking on stage and nobody is reacting to what you're saying and nobody's laughing, then you would quit and you would never return to it. And so the reason I find this so relatable is because of the idea of ministry, the idea of how badly I did the first couple of times I took a shot at public speaking. The first time was in high school, before I had any training through college, before I had taken any classes on how to compose myself, and the word keeps coming up And that's a habit that took me 3-4 years to break, to not stand up here and go, well, the Bible says, and to actually go through that. And so I watched this movie, and I watched it, and I'm just like, wow, I get it. I understand where he's coming from. I understand what it's like to try and work through this. And why do we do what we do? Like looking at that, why do I do what I do? Why do I set aside all my social abnormalities and get up in front of a bunch of people and speak? Like, where does that come from? Well, the example I want to go to is in Philippians chapter 4, of course written by Paul. It's towards the end of the chapter. What we're looking at is, specifically, we're going to be looking at Philippians 4, verses 10 through 13, specifically. But just a quick lead-up is, Paul is one of those people who, in my opinion, next to, of course, Jesus, has the most interesting of life stories. Paul has singularly the most fascinating of life stories because he has lived on both sides of the line. He's one of those people who was originally employed by the Romans to arrest and persecute and execute Christians. And then on the road to Damascus, he was struck blind and he saw Jesus, and he came to grips with the fact that his life was wrong, and he changed it around and he got his eyesight back. And it's just an absolutely fascinating story. And the heart of who Paul is really comes out in Philippians chapter 4. Starting in verse 10. I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Okay, starting right there, quick footnote. Paul has been imprisoned more than once in his life because of his beliefs. He has been falsely imprisoned, more so on top of that. In the modern media, when we read a story about a person who was wrongly convicted and spent X amount of months, years in jail, and then it turns out later they're exonerated and they're set free, we look at that situation and we're kind of heartbroken by it. Because it's this representation that we as a society have failed. Because we say that we have these laws in place to protect us. We say that justice will always prevail. But in these circumstances, when a person is falsely imprisoned, it's really heartbreaking because at the core of it, it makes us question our legal system. And I'm not saying it's a bad system. I'm just saying that it is run by flawed people and sometimes things get overlooked. In Paul's situation in particular, it is not the case. He is wrongly imprisoned on purpose. He is put in jail because he is stirring up too much trouble. And so he writes, and he is overjoyed by the fact that he has heard that the people, the church of the Philippians, they have shown concern for him, and they are worried about him, and they want to make sure he's doing all right, and he's overjoyed by this. But more importantly, he says that I'm overjoyed not because I need it, just because it's nice to hear from you. It's good to know that the work is being done, that the work of Jesus is being done. And the thing that really strikes me in this verse is the sentence, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Now, examining the lifestyle of the average Roman police officer, Paul probably led a pretty good life. He was a person who probably didn't want for anything. He probably didn't need anything from the world. There was always a meal to come home to. There was always a home to come home to. And abandoning this for the life of this spiritual nomad, this person who wanders and establishes and helps other churches and writes them encouraging words, it makes me wonder, how did Paul get to this place? And that's really what I wanted to look at, is the idea of what is the purpose of my life, of your life, the life that we have within our faith. What is the purpose of that? If not to look to Paul for the example. Continuing on. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. This is one of those things that frequently surprises me about the Bible. Now, think about your favorite book. Think about your favorite book you've read 1,000,000 times. Like, there's probably a half dozen novels I could name off the top of my head where I could say they're my favorite books and I read them over and over again. But it's not anything that surprises me. It's always like watching your favorite movie. It's like, oh, now we're coming up to my favorite part and I'm excited. And oh, here comes the big twist in the end and I'm excited. But I'm never surprised by something I've read before. Now, where the Bible differs in that is, like, the New Testament is this text of 2,000 plus years of history that actively surprises me. And more importantly, in the book of Philippians, it always surprises me because I've read it so many times. Because I had a professor in college who, when I was going through one of the worst spiritual crises of my life, said to me, read the book of Philippians. Because it takes about 20 minutes. And you can sit down and you can block out 20 minutes every day and you can read it. And so I've read Philippians and I understand what Paul is trying to convey and what he's trying to say. But last week I was surprised by the text I've read, in hyperbole like 1,000,000 times. And so I'm surprised by the attitude that Paul has when he's in this circumstance. When he says, I know what it's like to have plenty and I know what it's like to have nothing. Because we as people, especially in this nation, usually rest somewhere in the middle of that. I'm never going to own like a luxurious mansion, but I'm probably never going to want for anything. I've got a stable job, and I've got my apartment, and I've got my things, and, there's never a question of where my next meal is coming from. And so it's hard for me to imagine where this idea of, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want comes from. But Paul has been there. Paul has been there. And I look at this, and I'm inspired by the idea of this is where my faith derives from. Because ultimately, at the core of it, I am probably not one of those people who is content in any and all situations. If all of a sudden my apartment burned down tomorrow and I lost all my stuff, I would be devastated and I would be upset and I would want to know why and I would demand answers because as Americans we are entitled to answers. It's true. And so I'm not one of those people like Paul. Like, I can't just abandon everything. I can't just abandon this life of comfort and wander off to make the world a better place. Because what Paul does is he goes on this amazing journey where he suffers through great adversity and questioning glances like, hey, isn't that the guy who arrested my brother? And Paul is this remarkable person who writes in Philippians to this church that he is proud of them, which is stunning to say the least, because Paul deserves a parade. He deserves a medal. He deserves a big cash prize according to the standards that we have set up as a society. Because we like to say that the people who achieve the most, the people who do the most should get the most, but that is unfortunately not always the case. It is unfortunately not always the circumstance, because if that were true, my teachers in high school would make $1 billion because they go out and they teach and they educate and they don't make nearly what they should. But looking past all that, looking past what we feel like we're entitled to have as people, I look to the example of Paul, who has set aside this standard, who is beyond this standard, and says, I'm not entitled for anything. I'm going to go out there, I'm going to do the best job that I can, and we're going to see where that takes us. But more importantly, looking at the end of this passage, looking at verse 13, one of the world's most recognized, famous, familiar verses, I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. And this passage is twisted and warped and abused so often in life. I see it in any circumstances under the sun. Some that are worthwhile and some that are not. Because people wonder what this means. And what it means is to live the life. The reason it is connected to this passage, the reason that Paul himself has written this, is because he wants us to understand that the idea of doing anything through Him who gives me strength is brought out of the idea of doing something that is worthwhile. If it is something godly, if it is something worthwhile, if it is something worth putting the effort into, then Jesus will make sure it gets done. And that does not mean that in every good deed that we do, we will always succeed. Because even in failures, there are lessons. There are victories in failure. Because we can learn to adapt. We can learn to improve. We can learn to be more like Paul in this circumstance. And it's one of those difficult questions that we propose as Christians. To say, what does it really mean to do anything through Him who gives me strength? Because if I go out and I do what I think is right, and I do everything that I think is right, and I do not succeed, then what does that mean? Well, it means I've got to try again. There's a reason that saying exists. If you don't succeed, try again. And it's one of those things where I look to this example of Paul and I think, I want to be like that. I want to be like Paul. I want to be like this man who has set the standard to say, man, I'm in jail. That's a bummer. And that's Paul's attitude. I mean, think about that. That's insane by the way that we live our lives. If I'm thrown in jail tomorrow for something I did not do, I'm ringing all the bells. I'm pulling in every favor. I'm getting on the news. I'm going to get exonerated. But Paul's like, this is unfortunate. I seem to be in jail. But it's okay because I'm content. And I think, will I ever get to that point? But more importantly, this is why I got into ministry. Because I look at this example and I say, wow, I want to be that. I want to be that person. I want to work towards that. And on the one side, I don't know if I'm ever going to get there. And that thought kind of terrifies me. The idea that I may never be as good as Paul. But more importantly, the idea that I don't have to be. The important thing is, in verse 13, I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. The idea that I don't have to be as good as Paul, I just have to try to be. I have to follow this example. I have to be more like Jesus. I have to be inspired by that. And that is why we do what we do. Because I look at my life and I remove the equation that is Jesus. I remove the idea of faith and Christianity and hope and love and all that stuff. And I am terrified by the shell that remains of my life once that faith is gone. And that's the truth that I have to accept. I have to look at that and say, I need this in my life. I want this in my life. It has to be there. Otherwise, I am not a complete person. I will never be like Paul in that sense. To look at the circumstances, big and small, in our lives, because I've talked about that so often before. The idea that we, as people, feel like we're entitled, and it's okay when we're hurt, or when we complain, or when we get angry, or when we lash out against the world. And Paul looks at that and he just shakes his head. But the important thing is, Paul wasn't always there. Paul was once a completely different person. In the same way that we will be completely different people when we are transformed by the power of Jesus. To say that I need this in my life is an understatement. To say that I am motivated by this is an understatement. Because there's no way to overstate our connection with Jesus. To look at Paul and say, that's where I want to be. That's who I want to be. I want to be a disciple of Jesus, and I want to be inspired and motivated. And more importantly, I want to congratulate other people when they do good. The whole book of Philippians is Paul just pouring out adoration for this church. To say that you guys have done such a good job, and I'm always, in the very first couple of verses, he says, I thank God every time I think of you. And I wish I knew what it was like to get this letter from Paul as this church who he is congratulating. Like, no, you're the one who deserves the congratulations. And Paul says, no, I don't. It's all about Jesus. It's all about the idea that there's something out there bigger and more powerful and more wonderful than us. And I wanted to be encouraging and inspiring today. And I want to talk about the idea of this is why we do what we do. We do this because looking outside of my own life, looking at what could be there if Jesus was not, I'm saddened by that. And that's not to say that everybody out there who isn't a Christian is hopeless and condemned and all that. But I want to take what I know and I want to give it to them. I want them to be inspired by that. I want to bring more people in. I will never be content in my job until everybody is a follower of Jesus. And I know that's an outlandish goal to set for oneself. But I don't think there's anything wrong with striving for that. But ultimately, beyond all the work, the reason that Paul is content is because he knows that he has done everything that he can do, and he has to give the rest over to Jesus. He's in jail, he's writing letters to other churches, and he says, I will be content in any and all situations. Because what I have is so much bigger than my own strength. I can do all these things. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. Philippians 4, verse 13. The idea that that is how you reach that level of contentment, that is the mark to strive for. And if you're here today and you want to improve upon that, if you want to find that mark, if you want to give yourself over to it, I ask you to meditate on these things as we stand and sing the Song of Invitation.